Answer online at 560theanswer.com, on the AM 560 mobile app, on your Alexa-powered smart speaker, and on TuneIn, iHeart, and on Odyssey. Now, from the Signature Bank Studios, this is Chicago's Morning Answer with Dan Proft and Amy Jacobson on AM 560. The Answer.
Top of the morning, Dan and Amy. I'm watching this roundtable of yapping hyenas on CNN right now talking about the Trump indictment.
Yes.
And I guess the good news is so few people watch CNN that maybe it doesn't matter. But these are such unserious people.
I know.
This is
well,
all.
there's one Republican up there.
I don't care. This is all just so much fodder, part of the game.
Oh, they love this.
These people are disgusting, and they're stupid. I mean, dumb. They have no idea what they're talking about. You have people like Bakari Sellers on the panel, who's written more books than he's read. I did want to get to one thing, since this has been a question that several have asked.
Yes.
About state-level offenses, right? The president can't pardon state-level convictions, but a governor can. So that may or may not be helpful in Georgia for Trump, were he to be convicted of any of these charges, given Kemp as the governor. But in Georgia, it's even more complicated than that. Even if there was political pressure on Kemp to pardon Trump if he were convicted of any of these charges, in Georgia, there is a board of pardons and paroles, 5 members appointed by the governor, confirmed by the Senate. Also, to be considered for a pardon in Georgia, someone must complete their sentence, have no pending charges, and wait 5 years.
Oh.
So if he's convicted and sentenced to prison, then he's going to prison, basically. So I just wanted to address that. Alan Dershowitz, of course, famed Harvard law professor emeritus, he, reacting to this latest indictment, offered his take on what's happening here with all of these indictments. All 4 of these indictments, what's the real play here is to get Trump, which is, of course, the name of his book, he explained.
And I predict there'll be some convictions. I think the strategy is to get bad convictions, but to get them fast in New York, in Florida, in Washington, and in Fulton County. Then they'll be reversed on appeal, but they'll be reversed on appeal after the election. That's why everybody's rushing to get these cases tried. We now know that they want it tried within 6 months in Georgia. They want a trial in January in Washington, D.C. They want a trial in May in Florida. New York has been willing to put it off, but they're going to get on the bandwagon too. Everybody who is going after Trump, the whole get Trump approach, is to get him before the election. Convict him before the election. Then he wins on appeal. All right, that's tomorrow's news.
For more on this, we're pleased to be joined by Richard Epstein. He is the James Parker Hall Distinguished Service Professor Emeritus of Law and Senior Lecturer at the University of Chicago, that is. Professor Epstein, thanks for joining us again. Appreciate it.
Well, it's always good to be with you, Dan.
Is that is what Professor Dershowitz said there? Is that your take on what's happening here? This is the strategy: bad convictions, but get them quickly, and if you lose, if they're overturned on appeal at some point, so what?
Well, I think what happens is the people who are proposing this would get rid of the word bad. They say we'll get convictions and we'll try to defend them on appeal. And it is commonly the case that the more aggressive theory that you use at trial, the more likely it is that you ought to get a conviction, and the more likely it is that it's going to be overturned. And so if you start looking at the various kinds of cases through that lens, if you start looking at the Georgia situation, that is said in such incredibly broad terms that it's hard to think of anything that happened in the United States in the last 5 years which is not part of that criminal enterprise. And so I think it's fits that. But if what you do is you look at that, what I think is the most serious of these charges, the efforts to beat up Mike Pence in order to get him to flip the election, either send it back to the states or cast the ballots himself, that's a very focused charge. I think it's a very strong charge. I don't think there's anything in the Constitution that even allows him to count the ballots. It only says that he can open them and then they're counted by ministerial features. That case is very focused, and it seems to me that what's the best strategy for the prosecutor there, he's not going to listen to me, is you focus exclusively on that to get all the dubious free speech cases and the intangible services cases. And what you try to do is to show that the interactions between the Trump team on the one hand and the Pence team on the other hand rose to the level of a kind of belligerence. Now, this is not an easy thing to do. Let me just give you one parallel example. It is very clear that you are allowed to persuade people. It is very clear you're not allowed to coerce people. And then you just get to the very common question, what do you do with picketing? Is that coercion? Because you could basically get very close to somebody and wave your hand in a mallet? Or is it just persuasion in a particularly loud way? We have dealt with that under the labor laws. We've dealt with it under the abortion laws, just about everything you can imagine. And nobody has a very clear line. And so it's going to be, in this particular case, in trying to do that, you're going to have a very close examination of who said what to whom at what particular time. And you cannot predict, not knowing the way the record will unfold, who's going to prevail on that issue.
Well,
that's manageable.
Yeah, but on the Pence issue, too, they've got another problem there because they're going to have to argue in the alternative. Because the one they're arguing, many are arguing, that Trump knew he lost, and this was an attempt to illicitly overturn the election, knowing that he had lost the election. So there was, malice aforethought. But Mike Pence says the president, in my conversation with him, never communicated to me that he believed he had lost. So then it becomes, I'm pressing on my vice president. Maybe my legal theory was infirmed, but I'm pressing on my vice president to do what I think he can do because I think I won.
Yeah, I think the correct answer to that is that it's res judicata. All of these things are handled at the state level, and they transmitted it through. So his belief that he won the election is not a justification for asking the vice president to exceed his authority and by essentially sending this back to the states. That's the way I would argue. I think that's the most important.
Well, yeah, but I'm sorry to interrupt, but I mean, so what? It was improper for him to make the ask, but I mean. But unless he offered an inducement or made some sort of extortionary threat, he's just making to your point about picketing, he's just making a vociferous argument. It may be completely erroneous, but that's just an argument. That's a plea. That's a request. That's a complaint. That's not a criminal conspiracy.
What you have to do is to basically understand what the conversation is. That's what I said. This is going to be a fact-intensive hearing in which there's no way to predict it in advance. But what will happen is it's a decent prosecution. What they will try to do is triangulate this with all the other things that were told to Trump about the legality of this and so forth, and see if they can make it stick that he understood he was beyond his jurisdiction. And the defense will start to say that he had advice of counsel and all sorts of other things. This is the strongest case. I didn't say it's a lockstep case.
Yeah.
Cases having to do with speech and coercion are famously difficult in every other area of the law. And when you get something with the stakes this high, it's not going to be a very, very easy case to give you. Just to give you a sense of what the range of opinion is on that, I have several colleagues at the University of Chicago, Will Bowden and Mike Paulson. They argue that Trump engaged in insurrection and that he is banned under this. Well, I mean,
I know they do, but that's because
he wasn't even charged with insurrection.
Those are not. I mean, we have all sorts of people running around with law degrees and law professor jobs who are just completely blinded by their political viewpoints. I mean, that's the legal argument. It's an insurrection because I say it was. So. Okay, well,
I'm just telling you. I mean, these are not left-wing fanatics in terms of what they do. I looked at the text of the Constitution and I said, I don't know what they're sipping today, but it talks about insurrection in connection with rebellion and giving aid and comfort to the other people. It's an insurrection to try to upset this election. It's an insurrection to try to upset any election. So I think it's absurd. But on the other hand, there are people say it's completely protected by the First Amendment. So what you're doing is you're looking at something where if you can go from left to right 180 degrees, there are respectable people at every point on that curve. Yeah. That makes it a hard case. I do not believe the same thing is true with respect to what's happening in Georgia. I just regard that case as over the top.
Right.
I went back and...
Well, I was sorry for interrupting, but 12 of the 161 acts of racketeering, like he's some mob boss, were Trump's actual tweets. So why aren't his First Amendment rights protected?
Well, there's that also, the grotesque definitions of forgery. In this case, if you put your name on a ballot saying, I think I'm the correct guy, you're not forging the name of somebody else. What you're doing is you're asserting an independent claim. And what happens is all of the stuff that they're doing having to do with these issues are people essentially disagreeing with the outcome. They're not pretending to be somebody else. So these are not forgery claims of any kind of sort. And so what's happened is what she's done here is she's thrown the kitchen sink and she's giving very novel definitions of certain kinds of standard activities, forgery, impersonation, and so forth. And those are not definitions that have ever been used in the law, and then she treats them as self-evident truth. And you're trying to figure out what the criminal enterprise in this place. It's very difficult to compare it with racketeering. What you're trying to do is to take over a neighbor in order to, basically monopolize the heroin trade. If you look at the basic statute under the situation under RICO, it talks about investing the proceeds of a pattern of racketeering activity or acquiring and maintaining an interest and control of an enterprise, right? These are not what's happening in this case. So what she has to rely on is they participated in the affairs of an enterprise. Well, what counts as an enterprise in this particular case is now the effort to overturn the outcome of an election, which is not the kind of enterprise that you have in all the standard kinds of cases. So a statute which is intended to deal with mob activities and various kinds of corrupt sales is now being used to deal with political protest. And there's not the slightest recognition of this because you don't see in the indictment any real definition of what counts as the enterprise to which it's a part. I did go back, and thanks to the New York Times, it did something very useful. It gave you a copy of the entire transcript that took place between Trump and the Republican Secretary of State, Raffensperger, over the question. He said, "It's me votes." Well, you listen to what he's saying. He's not saying, go out and manufacture votes.
Correct.
This corruption has been so corrupt in the way in which it's going. I was out there at my rallies, and by God, you just heard mobs of people. How could I have lost when Joe Biden brings everybody to a rally and becomes a snooze fest? I won this thing. And what your job is to go back and make sure that you correct the irregularities. And this is against the background, by the way, where mysteriously in the middle of the night they shut down the Atlanta office, right, which was counting ballots and so forth. So there was on his mind a belief, whether true or false, that this was happening. And so the point you make about bona fides, right, has a very much more powerful role here than it does in the Pence case, because with Pence, the argument on the other side is even if you're right, you cannot ask somebody to do something which is beyond his particular power. And the only question you have to ask is, did you know it was beyond his particular power? And to that, the answer seems to me to be pretty strongly yes. But in this case, you're saying, you have the power. There have been a lot of irregularities. For God's sake, do it. And you got to get me up to the 11,000 some odd votes, because after that, it's irrelevant so long as I've won. This is basically, I think, protected speech.
Well, it's interesting, too. I mean, on the Pence thing, you still have, John Eastman and others that were advancing legal theories that...
Yeah, I know.
So he has advice of counsel he can rely on as a defense, too. But the other thing here is, here's how the Wall Street Journal editorial board characterized this in a sentence, the Georgia indictment. It treats Trump's attempt to reverse the 2020 election as if it were a mafia operation rather than bumblers who controlled no election machinery in Georgia or anywhere else. The alleged behavior was rotten, but inflating it into a RICO conspiracy makes the case less credible, not more. Is that a fair reading of it in your view?
I think it is. In my general view about criminal prosecutions, when you throw the kitchen sink at somebody and you throw it at everybody, what you do is you diminish from your strongest claim by putting up a lot of silly and frivolous claims, and therefore it undermines your entire credibility. But one of the things that I always talk to my students about is that if you've got a strong count in a criminal and a civil case, and somebody says, well, add this weak count. You do that, it's not A plus B. It's A minus B. That second case actually hurts you with respect to the first case. And here what you do is you run a situation where you're running this thing so broad that if you get Trump, you have to get a lot of other people whose connections with this are fanciful or not. It's just a mistake to go after him. And, you look at that indictment, and what does it say about the Raffensperger situation, right? Nothing, as far as I can tell. It's in there as a footnote or nothing. That's the key to this particular case. And so what you want to do is to say, now we look at this, and we say, fellows, I need 11,000 votes, meaning you have to re-examine the ballots that were cast to make sure they were correctly counted. That's what his context is. And if that turns out to be protected, then all the derivative and associated activities are probably going to be protected as well. And so what you have to do is, if you want to win this case for the prosecution, you have to give it the nefarious meaning. And this is a criminal prosecution. The statement is at best ambiguous. I do not think he crossed the line. Other people are going to say, yes, he has, but I don't see it. And
well,
so, you asked for my best opinion, I'm giving it to you.
The other thing with the Raffensperger call, unlike those who actually represented Trump in courts of law or represented him in hearings before legislative bodies, the election attorneys on that call, because it wasn't like it was just Trump and Raffensperger.
Right.
Meadows was on that call, but the election attorneys on that call, Meadows has been indicted. The election attorneys on that call haven't been.
Election attorneys talking for Trump?
Yeah, Trump's election attorneys, like Cleta Mitchell, who was on that call with Raffensperger, she didn't get indicted.
Well, she shouldn't get indicted.
I know she shouldn't get indicted, but I'm just saying it's telling.
Yeah, I think also, by the way, generally speaking, if you say that somebody who tells a falsehood to a legislative body is subject to a criminal indictment, at that point, essentially 90% of the people who testify before government on behalf of somebody are going to be exposed to at least the threat of indictment. So, the basic argument in these kinds of cases, you want to get something, if you're the prosecutor, which is big enough to catch Trump, the biggest fish you have, but not so big that it brings in a lot of little innocent features. And so the next kind of case in an unrelated matter, somebody's going to be able to throw the book at everybody.
Well,
and so in the Smith case, when he starts talking about honest services, forget about that. That's the kind of thing for which you have to show, reach a fiduciary duty. You want to talk about what happened on the steps of the Capitol? Forget about that. He said, go there and exercise your First Amendment right. Just drop that out and spend your time on the one hard case. And look, I mean, if you ask me what the chances of conviction are, if that is done optimally by both sides, I will tell you as a non-practicing lawyer, I think the odds are that Trump will lose. Not overwhelming, but I think it's more than 50%. I take a slightly different view from my esteemed host on this show.
Well, I'm not saying he won't get convicted. I'm just saying he should have never been indicted. But to like pull back on this now that we're through 4 indictments under our belt of a former president of the United States in the context of his running for election again. I mean, what is your view about the impact this has the last few months and what is to come? The impact it's had and will have on the future of our republic. I mean, I don't want to sound grandiose, but this is serious stuff here that we're dealing with.
Well, I'm very upset about all of that stuff. I mean, it's not the fact that there's a prosecution. There's a prosecution by a sitting president who manages to take an extremely strong person in Smith and run him in this particular case. He is known to be over-aggressive, as he was against the Virginia governor when he lost that case in the Supreme Court. And he's a hardline guy. Then, on the other hand, when it comes to dealing with Hunter, what you do is you get this bumbling fool who sits there and lets the statute of limitations run, gives sweetheart deals, and then gets promoted for his incompetence to shield his incompetence from further abuse. So I think the real problem that we're seeing here is one is that we see huge sense of differential senses of justice in this particular case, in which the Bidens are all coddled and protected on the one side, and the Trump people are pushed absolutely to the limit on the other. If you're asking me the deep philosophical question of whether or not I would punish Trump at all for these kinds, I think there's only one count that's worth bringing in light of our prosecutorial history, and that's the very dubious one about trying to switch the electoral stuff. But if you think, for example, about tweeting, think about what Hillary Clinton did with respect to when she ran a government server on an illegal site, and she was saying, well, she didn't know she violated the law, which of course she did. We're not going to prosecute her. These were live messages coming in and out. And what Trump is being prosecuted is waving a document before somebody, which is illegal. I have no doubt about it. But there was no transmission of information to foreign powers. The odds of Hillary Clinton having kept that server secure in some sense is close to zero. And she managed to walk. Well, you start looking at this kind of stuff, and the Trump claim that there are two sets of justices coming out here, two sets of rules, one for Democrats and one for Republicans, are going to be made. And then you do the other thing. How many times, I ask this question to everybody, how many times has Trump engaged in an illegal prosecution when he was president of his political enemies?
That's good.
Well, what's the answer to the question?
Zero.
Zero, right? And then you look at the Steele dossier, and then you look at the Mueller investigation, then you look at the way in which they go over the various kinds of people who are going to take offices and so forth. And it turns out it's just a nonstop charade going after him. And many of these things are bogus. So, I mean, just to take it, that thought that you bring an impeachment action against the President of the United States for basically hesitating on whether to make any foreign affairs grant to Ukraine and so forth, when that's in the heart of his presidential powers, and he's talking to the guy on a public telephone, that's crazy in terms of what you do. On the other hand, Lord knows what Joe Biden did with respect to get the Ukraine guy fired, and that's real interference in foreign affairs, and everybody salutes the man for his uncorruptible behavior. It's just too much of a double standard.
Richard Epstein is the James Parker Hall Distinguished Service Professor Emeritus of Law and Senior Lecturer at the University of Chicago. Professor Epstein, thank you as always. Really appreciate it.
Okay, thank you so much for the spirited discussion.
Thank you. Always a pleasure. And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line. Coming up on Chicago's Morning Answer.
We'll stay on this topic. Kamala 2018 on ballot integrity versus Kamala 2023 on ballot integrity. 737.
You're going to want to hear this one. But now let's head into the newsroom. Here is Mike Scott.
Sunshine, 62 degrees at 7:30 on AM 560. The